Today's episode is brought to you by Marvel Dice Throne. Here's everything you might have missed in Dune. The sleeper has awakened, the slow blade has penetrated the shield, and we finally have Wormsign, Dune fans. The most anticipated movie of 2020 and 2021 is now in theaters all over the world, and Dune is taking both fans and newcomers alike to a faraway desert planet full of sandworms, spice, and everything nice. Well, everything that can be nice about brutal battles between warring noble houses, the plans within plans of a secretive order of space witches, and visions of the future that fill you with terrible purpose. Directed by Denis Villeneuve, Dune adapts the first half of Frank Herbert's seminal sci-fi work and tees up a part 2 that we can't wait to see. Now, for a spoiler-free review of Dune and other deep dives into the Duniverse, make sure you head over to Nerdist.com. But today, we're going to be sipping on some Sappho juice to get our mentat on, so we can break down all the Easter eggs, hidden details, and things that you might have missed in Dune. Now, obviously, to do so, we need to spoil what happens in Dune, and we're going to be referencing materials from the book and maybe hinting at stuff that could play out in an eventual Dune Part 2. So if you're worried about that kind of thing, leave now before it's too late. And before we go any further, I do want to disclose that Dune is produced by our cool corporate dad, Legendary. Now, we'd be reporting on this anyway, but we want to be crisp knife clear about that from the get-go. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we?
Come with me.
Alright, let's begin exactly as the film does, with skull-rattling bass. Specifically the skull-rattling bass of the Sardakar throat-singing, intoning dreams are messages from the deep. Now, the Sardakar, who we'll meet later on in their rainy nightmare prison planet of Secundus, are the Emperor's elite commandos. This throat-singing is a new bit to their lore, but the message behind it, dreams are messages from the deep, is not exactly. All throughout Dune, we see young Paul Atreides, played by Timothée Chalamet, experiencing eerily lifelike dreams that often portend the future. As we come to learn, though, these aren't necessarily dreams, but rather prescient visions, glimpses into possible futures of what may come to pass. These dreams are conveying messages to Paul, warning him of what might happen if he follows a particular path. Now, the deep in question here is a long line of Paul's ancestors, whose memories he may one day be able to access to help guide him. As we come to learn, Paul is a candidate in a long line of candidates for the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood's breeding program. By manipulating politics and bloodlines, they're attempting to bring around the birth of the Kwisatz Haderach, someone who's capable of accessing genetic memory from both their male ancestors and their female ancestors. In Herbert's books, genetic memory is this idea that we can pass down memories and experiences from one generation to the next on the cellular level. But with that said, only a select few people can actually access said memories. It can be tapped into through rigorous Bene Gesserit training and the use of the spice melange, the psychotropic commodity found on Arrakis. The idea is that the Kwisatz Haderach, which means shortening of the way in the old Fremen language of Chakopsa, would use their prescient visions and messages from the deep to steer mankind along the golden path, the term for this optimal way forward through the many possible futures full of death, ruin, and despair. It's also a reference to the Hebrew term, the Kwisatz Haderach, which refers to miraculous travel between two distant places in a brief time, which in Paul's case is between the past and the potential future. Of course, as expected, things go off the rails awfully quickly, but that's a story of the future for future movies to tell. Here, though, it's a succinct way to tease Paul's dreams that aren't quite dreams and establish their importance right off the bat. As we'll see throughout the movie, Paul frequently has these visions of the future, or rather, the possible future. And there's a way you can actually decipher which are which. Kudos to our resident Dunatic, Matt Karen, for cracking the code. When Paul is having a vision of a potential future, it's gauzy and full of lens flare. And these are quite literally flashes of what could be. When Paul's having a vision of what will happen, there is no light flare, only a clear-eyed vision of what will come to pass if he stays on the path he's currently on. For instance, that vision of armor-clad Fremen and sandworms battling Imperial Sardakar on Arrakis led by Paul with spice-addled blue eyes, well, it starts hazy but gets clearer and clearer as Paul, deep in the throes of a psychedelic spice-induced vision, sees where the path he's on will eventually lead, and it terrifies him, as it well should. But Paul's consciousness isn't the only thing the dreams expand. They also greatly expand on the role of Jameis from the books as well. Now, before Paul's climactic crysknife duel with Jameis to prove his worth to Stilgar and the rest of the Fremen, we see visions of Jameis actually teaching Paul about Arrakis and their traditions. Sadly, these were visions of a possible future and cannot come to pass, because the path that Paul is on means he cannot be the friend of Jameis that he wants to be. Rather, he must choose to accept his terrible future by killing Jameis to find his way through the Coriolis storm of history that's unfolding all around him. And speaking of history, let's take a step back for a moment from psychoanalyzing Paul's dreams to talk about an Atreides artifact. On Caladan, we see the statue of a man fighting a bull and a massive bull head that was mounted on the wall. The statue is of the old Duke, Paul's grandfather Paulus, who was a bit of a showman and had a taste for bullfighting. But unfortunately, in his attempt to take life by the horns took his life instead, and now he's commemorated by relics like this statue and the stuffed head of the bull that killed him. And speaking of fun and games, it sounds like I'm actually getting a message from the deep right now, specifically from our sponsor, Marvel Dice Throne. Thanks again to Marvel Dice Throne for sponsoring today's show. Let me ask you something. Have you ever argued about which of your favorite Marvel Comics characters would win in a head-to-head fight or an all-out group brawl? Well, now there's an easier way than spending years studying chaos magic or letting a radioactive spider bite you. Marvel Dice Throne is a fast, fun, and endlessly replayable board game for all ages. Each player selects one of 8 iconic Marvel Comics characters to face off in a head-to-head battle to see who earns the right to claim the throne. With strategic dice rolling to activate special abilities, unique hero cards that can modify results, and upgradable hero boards to super power up your stats, Marvel Dice Throne offers endless entertainment, tactical battles, and surprisingly deep strategic possibilities. Marvel Dice Throne is currently being crowdfunded on Kickstarter and will feature tons of exclusive perks for backers. So check out their Kickstarter campaign now to reserve your copy today. Excelsior! Whoa! Oh, sorry about that, folks. I think there might have been too much spice in our office or maybe in my coffee this morning. I think I blacked out there for a minute. Where was I? Oh yes, tiny background details. Now throughout the film, you can see just how much love and care the production designers put into bringing these books to life, with things like the bas-relief sculpture on the old Duke's grave and in the training room where Paul and Gurney practice. Now apart from looking cool as hell, they also tie House Atreides to their ancient Greek roots, because in the books, they can supposedly trace their lineage all the way back to Agamemnon, and that sense of history really comes through in the film as well. Speaking of Paul and Gurney's training scene, that's our introduction to personal shields and a great segue to explain why in this far-flung universe full of massive spaceships, interstellar travel, and powers like the Voice, why so many battles are sword fights, knife fights, and straight-up hand-to-hand combat. Now the answer is twofold. For noble houses, many fighters wear those personal shields to protect them from projectile weapons. And as we learn, knives can penetrate the shields, but only through deliberate, slow movements. However, there is a much scarier reason why so many soldiers opt for melee weapons in shield fighting. Because laser-powered weaponry, or laser guns as they're called, do exist in the Dune universe, and they're mentioned a couple times in the film. The shields use something called the Holtzman effect to utilize the repellent force of subatomic particles to deflect most attacks. But when a laser gun beam hits a shield, it doesn't just pass through it, it doesn't bounce off, rather it creates a nuclear explosion, which has a tendency to kill, say, everybody nearby. So despite the highly advanced technology in the Duniverse, they tend to fight with swords and shields like knights of old, something they make fun of a bit in later books. As for the Atreides swordfighting technique, according to the art and soul of Dune, it was created by Roger Yuan, who also plays Lieutenant Lanville in this film. It's based on a 1950s martial arts technique known as Balintawak Eskrima, which involves using your open hand to help block your opponent's weapon. And the Atreides swords, if you look very closely, apparently have a small piece of technology embedded in the hilt to help slow down the blade when they make contact with the shield. Now, speaking of the Holtzman effect, that can also explain why characters like Baron Harkonnen can seemingly fly around like a big fleshy man-worm. In the books, the Baron can't easily move under his own power, so he uses something called suspensors to create a localized anti-gravity field for the person using them. We also see characters like the Sardakar and Duncan use them in the movie as well, so same technology but different purpose, all equally terrifying in execution. And while we're on the topic of Sardakar and executions, let's talk about one of the coolest scenes in the movie, the pre-combat ritual of the Sardakar on Seleucid Secundus. As mentioned earlier, Seleucid Secundus is the Padisha Emperor's prison planet where inmates are subjected to all manner of brutal trials and torture to mold them into elite killing machines. It's a world full of throat singing and throat cutting. As we see, officials or priests on Seleucid Secundus are draining the blood from people strapped to these massive crucifixes into a pool they can then use to anoint those who've completed their Sardakar training and are getting ready to go into battle. Now, I would say that it gives me blood for the blood god vibes, but considering how Warhammer 40k wears its Dune influences on its sleeve, I'll just call it a bit of creative Ouroboros and leave it at that. Now, a few other details are worth mentioning as well. Duncan Idaho's signature salute, which he gives to Paul, and Paul repeats later in the movie, is actually a nod to actor Jason Momoa's son. Speaking with IndieWire, Momoa revealed that his salute is a move from Kali, a martial arts technique native to the Philippines, which his son practices. Momoa said, "There's definitely these intimate moments where I'm signaling to my son. That's a Kali move where you put your hand on your heart and put it on your head. That's to Timothy in the movie, but that's to my son in real life." Now, another cool detail in the film is a blink and you'll miss it cameo by Gurney Halleck's Balisette. Looking like a combination between a guitar and a dulcimer, it's visible by Gurney's bedside during a quick shot during the attack on Arrakis. In the book, though, Gurney's equal parts war master and troubadour, playing the stringed instrument and singing all manner of songs. Many fans were a bit disappointed that we didn't actually get to hear Josh Brolin's dulcet tones in the film, although the actor told Nerdist in an interview they did in fact film scenes of him playing the balisette and singing.
And I did do some singing, and we've saved it. We've put it in a vault for later.
Is it going to be in part 2, do you think?
You have to ask the filmmaker. I don't know. It's his ultimate choice, but it's there to be seen.
Fantastic.
So who knows, maybe in part 2. But moving on, we come to one of my favorite details, and that is the little desert mouse. Now, we see this innocent little doofus a couple times throughout the movie, and book readers know it will play a much bigger role in part 2. And no, like, Paul doesn't get a Stuart Little-style companion, but rather, this little mouse is known as Muad'Dib in the Fremen language. And when Paul is inducted to the Fremen Society in Siege Tabor, he's asked to take on a Fremen name. One of the names that Paul chooses is Muad'Dib, inspired by this mouse, a creature who, as Stilgar tells us in the book, is wise in the ways of the desert, much like Paul instinctively seems to be. Now, another small detail is the reddish tattoo on the Mentats Thufir Hawat and Piter de Vries's lips. In the book, this is a red stain caused by consumption of sappho juice, a red liquid that helps Mentats parse vast amounts of data at astonishing speeds. Here, though, it doesn't seem like they're that one kid in your high school cafeteria that was just chugging high C all day, but rather it appears to be a formalized visual indicator of their role as mentats to imperial houses. In a behind-the-scenes clip from an IGN video, we see a deleted scene where Thufir and Piter come face-to-face after the invasion of Arrakis. Victorious, Piter says, "Checkmate, old friend," before tossing back a vial of sweet, sweet sappho juice. Now, obviously, things don't end too well for old Piter, but maybe, just maybe, we'll get to see some of that sappho juice in Dune Part 2 when it finally comes out. And last but not least, Dune is full of so many dazzling visuals and stunning tableaus, but some of its best shots are actually paying homage to the artwork of John Schoenherr, who provided the artwork for the original Dune dust jacket and illustrations for Dune's original serialized run in Analog magazine. For example, the shot of Paul and Jessica walking down a slanted dune, that is straight from the original book cover. And likewise, this shot of Fremen emerging from the rocks in the dark, that's a recreation of another Schoenherr work. And last but not least, this shot of several ornithopters flying through Arrakis' desert landscapes traces its visual roots back to another one of Schoenherr's iconic works. And there you have it, folks. That is everything we spotted in Dune, and I'm positive we're going to keep picking up on even more details the more we watch it, so fingers crossed we'll get a Part 2 announcement post-haste, because there are certain moments that I can't wait to see how they play out on the big screen. In the meantime, though, we'll have you covered with all manner of deep dives, essays, and explainers about all things Dune over on Nerdist.com. But for now, tell us, what did you think of Dune? Did you see it on IMAX, a regular theater, or did you watch it at home? And did you spot anything that we missed?
What did you see?
Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in the world of pop culture, make sure you stay tuned to Nerdist.com.